Every town has a man it has quietly decided to laugh at. Ours was Gus Renner, and the joke was the strange wooden shell he spent a whole summer building around his own house, a box around a home, a second skin of pine and tin that made no sense to anybody who drove past on Route 9 and shook their heads. We called it the crate. We called it Gus's coffin once the beer got into us. I called it worse than that, and I'm the one who has to live with remembering it. I'm going to tell you what that shed was for. I'm going to tell you about the night the thermometer fell off the bottom of every chart we owned, and the power lines came down like cut fiddle strings across the whole county, and the night I understood that the thing we'd been laughing at for 2 years was the only reason some of us are still breathing. But I want you to hold something in your mind first, the way I have to hold it, that a man can be right about the most important thing in his life and still be alone with it, because the rest of us were too busy being clever to listen. This isn't a story about a shed. It's a story about what it costs to be the one who saw the storm coming. So pour something hot and don't skip ahead. The cold in this part is the small kind. The killing cold comes later. I was 300 yards from Gus Renner's place, and already lying to myself about how cold it was. That's the first thing I want set down plainly, because I keep a log, have for 31 years, a green ledger with a rubber band around it that my late father would have called a sissy habit and used anyway. The log doesn't let me lie. So here's the entry, more or less, the way I'd write it if my hands weren't shaking. Feb 9. Wind out of the north, no let up since dawn. Snow not falling so much as traveling sideways, looking for a way into a man. Walked to Renner's because the truck wouldn't turn over and the phone lines were dead, and I had run out of reasons to stay home and pretend everything was fine. What I told myself, trudging through drifts that came up past my knees and then past my thighs, was that it was a brisk afternoon. Brisk. That's the word a man uses when he's afraid of the real one. The real one was somewhere around 20 below before you counted the wind, and the wind was doing arithmetic on my face that I didn't want to follow. I should explain why a 62-year-old rancher with bad knees was on foot in that, walking toward the one house in the county he'd sworn he'd never set boot on again. I should explain about the crate. I should explain about Gus. But that's the trouble with telling a thing honest. You have to start before the part where you come off looking decent, and I never come off looking decent in this. Not at the start. Let me back it up 2 summers. The Renner place sits on a low rise at the dead end of Route 9, where the county road gives up trying and turns to gravel and then to the kind of 2-track that's really just a memory of a road. Good land for nothing in particular. Gus's grandfather ran sheep on it, his father ran cattle and debts, and Gus ran a little of everything and a lot of nothing, which is to say he got by. He had a wife once. I'll get to her. 2 summers back in June, Gus started hauling lumber. Now lumber's no scandal. Everybody builds. But Gus didn't build a barn, didn't build a lean-to, didn't add a room for a baby that was never coming. Gus started building a house around his house. He set posts a good 4 feet out from his existing walls, all the way around, every side, and he framed up a second structure that completely swallowed the first. Floor to roof line. A box. A crate. From the road you couldn't even see the original farmhouse anymore. Just this raw new shell of 2x4s going up like a magic trick, where a home used to be. His old chimney poking out the top of the new roof like a man's head out of a sleeping bag. I'll be honest about the first time I saw it, because honest is the only currency I've got left to spend on this. I laughed. I was driving the feed truck back from the co-op with my hired man, Petey, riding shotgun, and we came around the bend and there it was, half-skinned in plywood, and I laughed so hard Petey thought I'd had a stroke. "What in the name of the good Lord," Petey said, "is Gus doing?" "Building a box," I said. "Man's building himself a box." "For what?" "For nothing," I said, and that was the part I was so sure of. For nothing. I want you to notice how easy that came to me. It's the easiest thing in the world, deciding another man's labor is for nothing. Costs you a nickel and feels like $1. By the 4th of July, the whole county had an opinion. At the co-op, at the diner, at the Tuesday auction, "You seen Gus's box?" became a thing men said to each other to start a smile. Somebody, I think it was Holly's Kemp, who's been mean since the 3rd grade and proud of it, started calling it the crate, and it stuck, the way the ugly names always do. Gus is shipping himself somewhere. Gus is afraid of the rapture. Gus is hiding from the wife. That last one made people laugh hardest, and that last one was the cruelest, and most of the time the people laughing were the same. Because here's the thing about Gus that everybody knew and nobody said straight. Naomi had been gone 2 years by then. I have to do this part slow. Naomi Renner was White Mountain Apache, from down near White River originally, and she'd met Gus when they were both young and working a fence-building outfit that traveled the whole state stringing wire for the big operations. The story, as Gus told it once, the only time he ever told me anything tender, both of us drunk at a Branding's years back, was that she could set a post faster than any 2 men, and she'd laughed at him for being slow, and he'd married her partly to make her stop laughing and partly because he never wanted her to. She was the one who made that place a home. I knew it even from the road. There were her chickens, her garden in raised beds she'd built herself with rock walls to hold the heat, her clothesline always sagging with color. When you drove past the Renner place with Naomi alive, you got the feeling somebody there was paying attention to things, to weather, to seasons, to the small mechanics of keeping alive in a hard country. After she died, a thing in her blood fast, the kind of fast that doesn't give a town time to organize a casserole schedule, the place went gray. The garden went to thistle. The chickens got sold or eaten by coyotes. Gus stopped coming to town for anything but feed and propane, and even then he didn't look at you. So when he started building the crate, 2 years into being a widower, the kinder reading would have been, "That's a grieving man doing a strange thing with his grief, leave him be." That's the reading a decent person lands on. I did not land there. I want that on the record. I landed on funny, and I stayed parked there for the better part of 2 years, and I'd give a good deal to have those 2 years back to spend differently. I drove out to his place exactly once during the building, that first August, and not out of kindness. Out of nosiness with a costume on. I told myself I was checking whether he needed a hand, which is the kind of lie that's comfortable because it's only 90% false. He was up on a ladder fitting the outer wall, and between the new outer wall and the old inner wall of the original house, there was that gap, that 4-foot dead space running all the way around, and he was packing it. That's what stopped me. He wasn't leaving it hollow. He was stuffing that cavity with everything a man could think of that holds still air. Straw bales jammed tight, wool batting, old feed sacks packed with sawdust. Crumpled newspaper by the bushel, going gray and then going dark as he tamped it down. And in places, along the north and west walls especially, he'd built in stacks of field stone and old brick and even sand-filled barrels, set close against the inner wall where the original house used to leak heat the worst. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, and I'll tell you exactly what I said, because I've replayed it enough nights that it's worn smooth. "Gus," I said, "you know they got a name for what happens to a man who insulates the outside of his house with garbage." He didn't look down. He just kept tamping newspaper into the cavity with a length of broom handle, patient as a man feeding a stove. "What's that?" he said, not a question, a door closing politely. "Hoarding," I said, and I laughed, expecting him to laugh too, the way men do to let each other off the hook. He didn't laugh. He set another sack of sawdust into the gap, lined it up just so, and he said, without heat, without anything I could push against, "Naomi used to say the cold doesn't come at you. It comes into you, through the things you forgot to fill." Then he climbed one rung higher and went back to work, and I understood I'd been dismissed by a man on a ladder, and I drove home feeling somehow like I'd lost an argument I hadn't even known I was having. I wrote in the log that night, I've still got it, Aug 14, visited Renner. Man has gone all the way around the bend, stuffing his walls with trash, said something about Naomi and the cold coming into you. Sad case. Glad it's not me. Glad it's not me. God forgive me, I wrote that down in my own hand. The crate got finished by October of that first year. From the outside it looked like exactly what we'd named it. A giant unpainted shipping box with a roof. A homely thing. A thing that made the whole stretch of Route 9 look like a place where something had gone wrong. He cut his windows to line up, inner and outer, with that 4-foot tunnel of dead air between each pane and the world, so that looking in Gus's window was like looking down a short hall to another, smaller window, and then his lamplight beyond that. He built his doors the same, an outer door, then the cold cavity, then the original house door, an airlock the way you'd find on a ship, or a meat locker, or one of those research stations at the bottom of the earth. We laughed at the windows. We laughed at the doors. Hollis Kemp said Gus had built himself a confession booth and forgotten to put in the priest. Even Petey, who's a kind boy at heart, took to calling it the crate, and I didn't correct him, because correcting him would have meant correcting myself, and I wasn't ready. That first winter after he finished it, the winter before the bad one, was mild. Almost no snow. The crate sat out there on its rise, doing whatever it did, proving nothing either way, and the joke went a little stale the way jokes do when the weather won't cooperate to feed them. People mostly forgot about it. People mostly forgot about Gus, which I think now was the part that hurt him worse than the laughing. There's a kind of being laughed at least means you're being looked at. I saw him maybe 4 times that whole mild winter, at the co-op once, at the feed store twice, at the gas station the week before Christmas, both of us filling up, the pumps clicking between us, and I almost said something kind. I had it loaded. How you holding up out there, Gus? 5 words. I've had 31 years of practice writing down what I do and don't do, and I'm telling you I don't have a clean record of why I didn't say it. The pump clicked off. He capped his tank. He nodded at me, the smallest civil nod a man can give and still call himself raised right, and he drove off toward Route 9 and the crate, and whatever he did in there alone, and I drove the other way, and the 5 words went home in my throat where they'd been living for a year and a half. That's the part nobody tells you about being unkind to a quiet man. It isn't loud. There's no scene. It's just 1,000 5-word kindnesses you decline to spend, one pump at a time, until you look up and a man's been alone in a box on a hill for 2 years, and you help put him there with nothing heavier than a smirk. The bad winter announced itself slow and then all at once, the way the worst things do. The almanac said hard. The old-timers at the diner said hard, and the old-timers are wrong more than they're right, but they say it with such confidence that you remember. By the last week of January, we'd had 3 storms stacked one on the other, each one not quite letting the snow settle before the next came in on top. The county graders were running themselves ragged and falling behind. The propane truck got stuck twice making the rural runs, and the company started rationing deliveries. We'll get to you when we can get to you, which is a sentence that sounds reasonable in October and sounds like a threat in February. I had 90 head to keep alive and a hay supply I'd misjudged, because I'd believed the mild winter was the new normal the way a fool believes any one good year. I was burning through feed and burning through propane and watching the long-range forecast crawl across the bottom of the television like a snake, and the snake kept saying the same word, historic. They love that word, the weather people. Historic. It means we have run out of normal words. And on the 8th of February, the National Weather Service put out the kind of bulletin that they print in all capitals, the kind that uses the phrase life-threatening, the kind that tells you to shelter in place and check on your elderly and don't, under any circumstances, travel. A mass of Arctic air the size of 3 states sliding down out of Canada with nothing in the plains to slow it, riding in on a wind that would push the real temperature, already falling toward 20, 25 below, down into a wind chill they were estimating at 50 below and worse in the open. 50 below. I want to tell you what 50 below is, for those of you who have only read the number. 50 below is a temperature that does not care about your wool, your down, your good intentions. 50 below kills exposed skin in minutes and a careless man in less than an hour. 50 below freezes a water line buried where the code says it'll never freeze. 50 below comes for the old and the alone and the ones whose furnace was already coughing. And it comes, just like Naomi told Gus, not at you but into you, through every gap and seam and forgotten place, through every cavity you didn't fill because you were too busy laughing at the man who filled his. The storm hit on the 9th. The power went a little after noon. I've been through outages. Everybody out here has. You light the lamps, you run the Jenny, you wait. But this wasn't a down branch on a single line. The bulletin had been right and then worse than right. The wind tore through the high lines somewhere up north and brought the whole regional grid down like a curtain, and the substation that fed our county went with it. And within the hour I understood from the dead radio and the dead phone and the dead nothing of it that we weren't getting power back in an afternoon. Maybe not in a day. Maybe, and this was the thought that put real cold into me, the inside kind, maybe not for the duration of a storm they were calling historic. My Jenny ran my well pump and my furnace fan, but my Jenny ran on gas, and I had 2 cans. And 2 cans is a number that looks fine until you do the arithmetic the wind was doing. I shut everything down but the essential and I sat in my kitchen in my coat, and I watched the propane gauge and I watched the window go white and then whiter, and I did the thing a proud man does last and should do first. I admitted I was scared. Not for the cattle, though I was sick about the cattle. For myself. For the simple animal fact that the temperature in my own house was dropping a degree every 40 minutes or so, and that I was a single man, 62, with bad knees, alone at the end of a road the graders couldn't reach, and that the only neighbor within walking distance was a man I'd spent 2 years helping the whole county turn into a joke. I looked out my west window, the one that faces toward Route 9, and through the blowing snow up on its low rise, faint and yellow and warm-looking in a way that made no sense, was a light. Gus Renner's light, burning steady. The crate lit up from inside like a lantern somebody'd hung out for a lost traveler. And I sat there in my own dark kitchen, in my own coat, with my own breath starting to show. And I had a thought that I'm not proud of and that I'm going to write down anyway, because the log doesn't let me lie, and neither anymore will I. How is that fool's box still warm? It would take me the rest of that night, and the longest walk of my life, and a thing I saw inside that house that I'll carry to my grave, to understand that it wasn't the box that was warm. It was everything Naomi had tried to tell us, packed 4 feet thick into the walls, holding the cold out of a grieving man's home long after the rest of us had run out of heat, and very nearly run out of time. I pulled the rubber band off my log, and I wrote 1 line by the last of the gray windowlight, because I had a feeling I'd want to remember exactly when I stopped laughing. Feb 9, power's gone, phone's gone, going to Gus's. God help me going to Gus's, and I don't even know if he'll. I didn't finish it. There wasn't time, and anyway, I didn't yet know how that sentence ended. The walk should have been 10 minutes. It took me close to 40, and I counted every one of them, because counting was the only thing keeping me from sitting down in the snow, and I had been around long enough to know that sitting down in the snow is how it gets you. Not with drama, with comfort. The cold tells you near the end that you're warm. That's the cruelest lie in the whole arsenal of winter. And I'd heard it kill better men than me, and I kept my feet moving by promising myself I'd get to write about it later if I just didn't stop. I went out my own door into a world that had stopped being a world. There was no sky and no ground and no horizon, only white, traveling, screaming white, and a wind that hit me broadside and tried to take my hat and then tried to take my face. I dressed for it the way you dress when you've spent your life out here. Long johns, 2 shirts, the heavy coat, the good gloves, the scarf wound up over my nose so only my eyes showed, and within 100 yards none of it mattered the way I'd believed it would, because 50 below doesn't fight your clothes. It goes around them. It finds the gap at your wrist, the seam at your collar, the patient little failures of every garment ever sewn, and it comes into you, exactly, precisely, word for word the way Naomi Renner had said it would to a man on a ladder, and I had laughed. I wasn't laughing now. I was praying, a little in the unpracticed way of a man who only remembers the words when the wind takes everything else. My eyelashes froze. I want that down because nobody believes it until it happens to them. The water in your own eyes freezing the lashes into little crusts so that you have to break them apart with a gloved finger to keep seeing. The hairs in my nose froze stiff. My knees, the bad ones, stopped sending pain after a while, which a smarter man would have worried about more than I had the room to. I kept the yellow light ahead of me, the way a ship keeps a harbor, losing it in the gusts, finding it again, losing it. And every time I lost it, I had the certain feeling I'd already drifted off the line and was walking out into open country to die. And every time I found it again, I made a noise into my scarf that wasn't quite a word. And the whole time, under the counting and the praying and the breaking of ice off my own face, one thought kept circling like a dog that won't settle. What if he doesn't open the door? Because why would he? I'd have understood it. 2 years of the crate, of Holly's Kemp, of a county that turned his grief into a punchline, of the pump clicking between us at the gas station while I swallowed my 5 kind words, and now here came one of the laughers, hammering on his airlock in the worst storm in living memory, wanting in. If Gus Renner had stood on the other side of that door and let me freeze, I'd have had no speech to give the angels about the injustice of it. I'd have earned it. I knew that, stumbling up his rise with my dead knees and my frozen lashes, and I think knowing it is the only thing that kept me honest enough to keep going. A man with a clear conscience would have felt entitled to be saved. I just felt like I was about to find out what I'd built, the same as Gus had found out what he'd built. The difference was his was made of straw and stone and love, and mine was made of 2 years of smirks, and only one of those keeps the cold out. I reached the outer door, and I beat on it with the side of my fist, because my fingers wouldn't make a knock. Nothing. I beat on it again, and I heard my own voice come out of me cracked and small and stolen instantly by the wind. Gus, Gus, it's Cal. Cal Brunn opened. And the door opened. Not all the way, a hand's width, and in the gap a slice of Gus Renner's face, lamplit, unsurprised, looking at me the exact way he'd looked at me from the top of that ladder a year and a half before, without heat, without anything I could push against. For one long second that I will feel in my chest until I die, he just looked. And the wind howled. And I understood that whatever happened next was entirely, completely his to decide, and that it was fair, and that fair might be the end of me. Then he stepped back and pulled the door wide, and said the most ordinary thing in the world. Get in before you let all my heat out. I'm going to slow down here and tell you about the inside of the crate, because the inside of the crate is the whole story, and I'd been laughing at the outside for 2 years like a man laughing at a book by its cover. You came in through that outer door into the cavity, the 4-foot dead space we'd all mocked, the tunnel of packed straw and sawdust and stone. He shut the outer door behind me, and for a moment we stood together in that little airlock in near total dark and near total quiet, and that was the first thing that undid me. The quiet. Out there the wind had been a living animal trying to kill us. In here, with the outer door shut and the inner door not yet open, the wind was a distant complaint, a thing happening to somebody else, a long way off. 4 feet of stuffed wall had taken the loudest thing I'd ever heard and turned it down to a murmur. Then he opened the inner door, the original farmhouse door, and the warmth hit me like walking into July. I don't mean it was comfortable. I mean it was warm, truly warm, shirt-sleeve warm, the kind of warmth my own house hadn't held since noon and wouldn't hold again that night. There was a wood stove going in the middle of the original front room, a good hot fire, but here's the thing that stopped me cold even as I was thawing. It was a small fire. A modest little fire in a modest little stove. Not the roaring inferno you'd need to heat a house against 50 below. A frugal fire. A fire a man could keep fed for days on what he had stacked. And it was heating the whole house easy because the house wasn't fighting the storm. The straw and the sawdust and the stone in those walls were fighting the storm, 4 feet thick, all the way around, and the little fire only had to make up the difference. And the difference, it turned out, was almost nothing. I stood there dripping and shaking and breaking the last ice off my lashes, and I looked at that small, contented fire, and I started to laugh. But it came out wrong, came out as something closer to a sob, the way laughing does when it's really the other thing wearing a coat. "It's the gap," I said, stupid. The first thing I'd said to him in over a year, and it was "it's the gap." The 4-foot gap, that's Gus, that's the hole. "Dead air doesn't move heat," he said, hanging my coat by the stove without being asked, the way you'd do for anybody, the way I'd never once done for him. Naomi's grandmother's people knew it. Layer your walls, trap still air. Put your stone where the cold leans hardest and let it hold the day's warmth into the night. He said it flat, reciting, but I heard the crack under it when he said Naomi's grandmother's people, the smallest catch, a man stepping carefully around a wound. Modern houses are sieves. One wall, some pink fluff, a fancy furnace working itself to death to replace the heat that's pouring out faster than it can make it. Take the furnace away and they die in a night. He looked at me. "Yours dying." "Jenny's running the furnace fan on the gas I got," I said. "Which is 2 cans. Which is I didn't finish." "Which is nothing," he finished for me, not unkind. "Sit down, Cal, you're gray." I sat down. And that was the moment, sitting in Gus Renner's warm front room in a chair, that I realized, with a fresh lurch, was a chair Naomi had reupholstered, the fabric a faded red with little birds on it. That was the moment the night got bigger than me and Gus. Because there was a knock at the outer door. It was Petey. My hired man, Petey, 24 years old and not the brightest lamp on the porch, but kind the way I should have been, who'd waited out the first hours of the outage in his trailer behind my barn, and then, when his own little space heater died with the Jenny, had done the only smart thing of the night and followed my tracks through the snow before they filled in. He came into the airlock half dead and crying without knowing he was crying, and Gus pulled him in and sat him by the stove next to me and put a cup of something hot in his shaking hands, and I watched Gus Renner, the joke, the recluse, the man in the box, quietly become the only safe place at the end of Route 9. And then there was another knock, and another. I never did get the full story of how the word spread, because there was no phone and no radio, but I think it was the simplest thing in the world. People in failing houses, looking out their windows into the killing dark, saw the same yellow light I'd seen. The one warm light in a county gone black. And they did what cold and frightened people have always done since the first fire. They walked toward it. The Bensons came, the whole family, the 2 little ones wrapped in everything they owned, carried the last quarter-mile by a father whose face, when Gus pulled the door open, I will never forget. A big proud man who'd called the crate a coffin at the diner not 2 months back, standing in the airlock with his children, unable to speak. Just shaking his head, I'm sorry, I didn't," and Gus saying, "Get them by the stove," like the apology was beside the point, like the only point was the children. Old Mrs. Lindqvist came, 81, who lived alone in a tin-roofed place a half-mile off and should, by every law of that night, have died in it, brought by her grandson on a snowmobile he'd nearly lost twice in the whiteout. The Ray's brothers came. The Kemps came. The Kemps, Holly's Kemp, who named the crate, who'd said Gus had built himself a confession booth and forgotten the priest, came stumbling up that rise with his wife and his old mother, and stood in the airlock and could not look Gus in the eye. And Gus, I was watching. I'll always be watching. Gus looked at Holly's Kemp for 1 second longer than he'd looked at me. 1 second. The whole 2 years lived in that second. And then he stepped back and opened the door and said, "There's room by the wall." And Holly's Kemp walked into the warmth of the box he'd spent 2 years mocking and put his hands over his face. and his shoulders went, and nobody said a word about it, because there are some kinds of crying a man is owed in private even in a crowded room. By full dark, there were 19 people in Gus Renner's house. 19 people who, the summer before last, had driven past on Route 9 and laughed. I keep a log, I've told you that, and I want to tell you what I did sometime in that long crowded night, because it matters to what comes after. I'd brought the log. Of course I'd brought the log. I'd grab it before I grabbed my own wallet. My wife used to say back when I had a wife to say things. And at some point, wedged in the corner by Naomi's red bird chair with a child asleep against my arm, one of the Benson little ones, just laid herself against me the way exhausted children do, trusting the nearest warm adult. I took out the green ledger and the stub of pencil and I tried to write the day, and I couldn't. I couldn't write Feb 9 and a tidy line about the weather. The thing was too big for the green ledger, so I wrote instead the only true sentence I had. I was wrong about everything that mattered, and the man I was wrong about is keeping 19 of us alive tonight with his dead wife's grandmother's knowledge, and not one of us has had the decency to say her name out loud since we came in out of the cold. I read it back, and then I did something I'd never done in 31 years of keeping that log. I closed it, and I put it away, because some things you write down to remember and some things you've already learned too well to need the ink. Here is the morally heavy thing. Every story like this has one, and I've been circling it, because I don't come off any better in this part than in the rest. And neither, if I'm honest, does the simple version of Gus the Saint that the county tells now. Around midnight, the storm not letting up, the 19 of us settling into that strange, warm, crowded peace, the Reyes brothers realized their uncle wasn't accounted for. Tomas Reyes lived alone in a cabin out past the old Haverson Quarter, 2 miles off, no neighbors, a stubborn old bachelor with a bad hip who'd refused to leave his place his whole life and had, the brothers were now sick to realize, almost certainly not seen the light, had no way to know the rest of us had gathered, was very likely sitting in his own failing cabin in the dark doing the arithmetic of Ken's the way I'd done it, except with nobody's tracks to follow because nobody knew to make them toward him. 2 miles and 50 below, in a whiteout in the dark. The brothers wanted to go. Of course they did. And every man in that room knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach before your head catches up, that 2 miles in that night was not a rescue. It was a second funeral. We had 19 people alive in a warm house. Sending 2 more out into that, younger Reyes had already half frozen just coming the quarter mile from the snowmobile, was very possibly trading 2 living men, and a maybe already gone old one for nothing but more grief and more bodies the spring melt would have to give back. I watched the room do the math. I watched the room land quietly terribly on the answer that math gives you. You can't stay, keep the living alive, grieve Tomas in the morning. It's the right answer. It's the answer that keeps 19 breathing. I've made that answer myself in lesser storms, and I've defended men who made it. It is not cowardice. It is arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't have a conscience, which is exactly why we lean on it when our own consciences can't bear the weight. And then Gus Renner stood up and started putting his coat back on. The same coat I'd watched him hang by the stove. He pulled it on and he wound a scarf, and he took down a coil of rope from a hook by the door. Already there, already coiled, a man who'd thought about this kind of night long before the rest of us, and the younger Reyes brother said, "Gus, you can't, it's..." And Gus said the second most ordinary thing he said all night, said it while tying the rope to his own belt. Naomi went out for a stranger once, froze 2 toes off doing it, said she'd do it again. He looked at the room full of people who'd laughed at him, full of children sleeping, full of the math that said stay. Somebody anchors the rope here. I'll walk the fence line west to the quarter and back. If I tug 3 times, you pull. He paused at the inner door. He didn't make a speech. Gus never made a speech in his life. He just said, a man shouldn't die in the dark not knowing there was a light, and he opened the door into the cold. I want to tell you, I stood up and went with him. I want that for the log so badly I can taste it. But I'll tell you what's true instead, because that's the only thing I've got left to give Gus Renner, who gave the rest of us everything. I held the rope. That's all I did. 62 and bad kneed and freshly thawed, I was no use on the fence line and I knew it. And so I did the only thing I could do, which was wrap that rope twice around the wood stove's iron leg, and once around my own 2 fists and brace my boots against the floor and become, for the next 2 hours, an anchor. A dead weight. A thing that holds still so a braver thing can move. And I prayed for 3 tugs that meant pull, and I dreaded 3 tugs that meant pull. And I sat in the warm room full of sleeping children with the rope cutting white lines into my palms, paying it out inch by inch into the screaming dark, as Gus Renner walked out along his fence line toward a stubborn old man who didn't yet know there was a light. The rope went out and out and out. And then, sometime past 1 in the morning, it stopped going out. And it didn't move at all. A rope tells you things. I learned that in those 2 hours, learned it the way you learn anything that matters, which is to say with my hands and not my head. A rope going out steady means a man walking. A rope that jerks means a man fallen and risen. A rope that drags heavy means weight on the other end you didn't put there. And a rope gone perfectly still, not slack, not pulling, just still, the way Gus Renner's rope went still sometime past 1 in the morning. A rope gone still means the man has stopped, and you don't know why, and there is no message in stillness, only the absence of one. And that absence is the loudest thing a frightened man ever held in his 2 raw hands. I sat against the wood stove's iron leg with the rope biting, and I did not move, and I did not let the rope move, and I counted. I told you counting was how I'd gotten across the snow. Counting was how I got across that stillness too. I counted to 60, and the rope didn't move. I counted to 60 again. Behind me the room had gone quiet in that watchful animal way a room goes when everyone is awake and pretending not to be. The children asleep, but the grown ones all listening. All of us tied to the far end of that rope by something stronger than hemp. The younger Ray's brother knelt down beside me without a word and put his hands on the rope below mine, sharing the anchor, sharing the dread. His knuckles were split from the cold. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything. We just held it together, the 2 of us, an old man and a young one, holding still so a brave one could be lost or found out in the dark. I'll tell you the truth about prayer, since I brought it up walking over, and I'd hate to leave it dishonest. I didn't pray for Gus to live. I didn't have the steadiness for a prayer that big. What I prayed, over and over, was smaller and uglier and more human than that. I prayed, don't let it have been because of the rope. Don't let him have stopped because the line ran out, because I'd anchored it wrong, because the one job I'd been given, hold still, was the job I'd failed. Even there, even then. I was praying about myself. I'm not proud of it. I've stopped expecting to be proud of myself in this story. I just keep telling it true because true is what I owe him. And then the rope moved. Once. The whole room felt it through me. I must have made a sound. Once was nothing. Once could be a stumble, a snag, a body shifting in the wind. We all knew the signal. 3. 3 meant pull. 3 meant I have him, or I am done, or come get what's left. 3 meant something, and 1 meant only that the far end of the rope was still attached to something that could move it, which, God help me, was more than the stillness had promised. Then, 2. A pause that lasted a year. 3. Pull, somebody shouted, and the room came apart and came together all at once. Every able body that wasn't holding a child was on that rope. Holly's Kemp's big hands above mine, the Bensons, the Ray's boys, old Mrs. Lindquist's grandson, the whole laughing county of 2 summers ago hauling on one line in one direction with one purpose. And I let go of the anchor and joined the pull, my torn palms screaming, and we hauled Gus Renner's rope in hand over hand, and it came heavy. It came heavy. Heavier than 1 man. They came through the airlock together, the 2 of them, and I will spend whatever years I've got left trying to describe it accurately, and I'll never get it. Gus had Tamaz raise on his back, had carried him. I learned the geography of it later, most of a mile, because Tamaz's bad hip had finally quit out there in the cold, and the old man had gone down by his own dead wood stove, half frozen and fully resigned, sitting in his dark cabin doing the arithmetic and arriving at the answer alone, the way I'd nearly arrived at it, the way Mrs. Lindqvist would have, the way every soul in that room had been one failed furnace away from arriving at it. Gus had walked in on him. Gus had said, Tamaz told us this weeks later, in the spring, weeping, an old bachelor who'd never wept in front of another man in his life. Gus had walked into that freezing dark and said, "You're not doing this in the dark. There's a light. Come see the light." And when Tamaz couldn't walk, Gus had tied the old man to his own back with the rope and turned around and followed the fence line home with 200 extra pounds of dying neighbor riding him through 50 below. The stillness, the long, terrible stillness that had been Gus stopping to lash Tamaz on. The one tug, the weight, the two, the three, that had been a man with frozen hands fighting knots he could no longer feel, trying to send a signal his fingers had stopped believing in. We got them in by the stove. We got Tamaz breathing easy and his color coming back and the women working his hands and feet the slow, careful way you do it. Never fast, never hot, the way that hurts going but saves what's there. Tamaz would keep his hands. Tamaz is alive today. Tamaz brings Gus a smoked ham every Christmas now and cries every time, and Gus tells him to quit it, and Tamaz never does. But Gus had given Tamaz his gloves somewhere out on that fence line. We found that out when we peeled the coat off him. He'd given a freezing man his gloves and walked the last mile working knots and gripping rope barehanded in 50 below, and his hands, when they came out of the dark and into the lamplight, were not the color hands are supposed to be. He lost 3 fingers. Off the right hand, 1 off the left, taken at a clinic 40 miles off once the graders finally punched the road through. 3 days into a storm they did call historic in the end, did print in all capitals, did write into the record books the way they'd promised. 3 fingers and the very tip of 1 ear. The doctor said he was lucky. The doctor was right, the way doctors are right and useless at the same time. Gus was lucky. Tamaz was lucky. 19 people who walked toward a yellow light were lucky. And the luck cost Gus Renner 3 fingers, and I have never once heard him call it a cost. I heard him call it exactly once, about what Naomi paid. 2 toes for her, 3 fingers for him. He said it like a man checking a sum and finding it came out fair. There it was again, the arithmetic. But his arithmetic and the room's arithmetic had never once been the same arithmetic. The room had counted 19 alive, don't risk 2 more. Gus had counted a man is in the dark and doesn't know there's a light. Both sums are true. Only one of them is the kind of true you'd want carved on your stone. I have to tell you about the numbing. The storm broke on the 3rd day. The power came back on the 5th. By the 6th, the roads were open enough that people could go home to houses that had survived the killing cold by dumb luck or hadn't, and the great strange crowded warmth of those days in the crate began, naturally, to thin and disperse the way all gathered warmth does. People drifted home. People have to. But before they went, and this is the part I closed my log to remember and don't need ink for, before they went, on the last night, with the wind finally quiet, and the stove finally allowed to burn low because the world outside had stopped trying to kill us. Mrs. Lindqvist, 81 years old, who'd buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her own reasons to be gentle, looked around that warm room at all of us, and then she looked at Gus where he sat with his bandaged, ruined hands in his lap. And she said, "Naomi would be proud of this house, August." She used his Christian name. Nobody used his Christian name. And she said Naomi out loud, the name we'd all been stepping around for 3 days like a hole in the floor, the name not one of us had had the decency to speak though we were alive because of what she knew, and the room went so still you could hear the low fire settle. And Gus Renner, the joke, the recluse, the man in the box, the man who never made a speech in his life, looked down at his hands and his shoulders began, very slightly, to shake. And then the whole room said her name. Not all at once. Not like a chant, nothing so neat. It went around the room the way warmth goes around a room, one person and then another. The Bensons and the Ray's boys and Petey and Holly's Kemp choking on it. Naomi, Naomi. She'd be proud, Naomi. 19 people finally. 2 years and 2 days too late. Saying out loud the name of the woman whose knowledge had just kept every one of us from freezing to death. And Gus sat in her red bird chair with his 3 lost fingers and let us. Just let us. Let the name fill the 4-foot cavity of every wall she'd told him to pack, the still air finally holding the only thing it had ever really been built to hold. I didn't say it loud. I couldn't get it past the place in my throat where I'd kept those 5 kind words at the gas station for a year and a half. But I said it. Naomi. And I think, of all the things I did and failed to do that winter, that one quiet word is the only one I'd want her to have heard. The thaw came, eventually, the way it always does, indifferent and green. The county went back to being the county. People are people. The casserole stopped. The gratitude got folded up and put away in the drawer where we keep the feelings that are too big to use every day. Holly's Kemp still isn't a nice man. I want to be honest about that, because the lie would be to tell you that one night fixed everybody. It didn't. It fixed some things and left most things exactly as crooked as they'd always been. But it fixed the laughing. Nobody calls it the crate anymore. Nobody's called it the crate since the morning the roads opened, and I don't think anyone decided that on purpose. It's just that you can't keep a name that was only ever made of contempt once the contempt has frozen its own fingers off discovering it was wrong. The name died of embarrassment. Now folks just call it the Renner place again, like before, like it was a home, which it was, which it had been all along while we were busy with the costume of it. And here is the part that I find I can't tell without stopping a moment, because it's the part that means the most and explains the least. That spring and the spring after, men in our county started building. Not boxes around their houses. Nobody was going that far, and Gus would have been the first to tell them they didn't need to. But layers. Second walls on the north sides, straw bale skirting. Stones set up against the cold leaning faces of old farmhouses to hold the day's warmth into the night. The Bensons did it. The Ray's brothers did it. Petey did it to his trailer badly, and Gus drove over with his ruined hands and showed him how to do it right, patient as a man feeding a stove, the same patience he'd had on the ladder while I stood at the bottom of it being clever. I built mine the 3rd spring. I'm not too proud to tell you I cried doing it, packing sawdust into the gap with a length of broom handle. Hearing a dead woman's voice in a living man's mouth. The cold doesn't come at you, it comes into you, through the things you forgot to fill. We'd all forgotten to fill so much. That's the thing I keep arriving at, the thing the log can't quite hold. It was never only about the walls. I should end this. The prompt of my own conscience says wrap it up, tie it off, tell them what it meant. But Gus never made a speech in his life, and I've spent 3 parts of this learning from him, so I'll resist the urge to make one now. I'll tell you instead about last week. Gus is older now and slower, and the hands give him trouble in the cold the way you'd expect 3-fingered hands to. He doesn't talk about his health, and I don't ask, which is its own kind of friendship out here, the kind that respects a man's right to his own arithmetic. But last week I drove out to the Renner place, The road's good now, and Gus was out behind the house, in the lengthening light, setting posts. New posts. A good distance out from a smaller structure he started, off to the side of the main house, a little building going up plank by careful plank with his bad hands. "What are you building, Gus?" I said, and I heard, even as it left me, that I'd asked it the exact way I'd asked it the first time, 2 summers and a lifetime ago, except that this time there was no smirk in it anywhere. This time it was the most honest question I owned. He didn't look up from the post, same as the ladder. Some men never do change the shape of how they answer you, they only change whether you've earned the answer. "Schoolhouse," he said, "of a sort." He tamped the dirt around the post, slow, working with what he had left. "Folks keep asking me how the walls go, easier to show them than tell them. Figured I'd build a little room where the showing can happen. Layer it up proper, Naomi's way. He paused, and the light was doing that thing it does out here in the early evening, going gold and going long, laying itself across the snow that hadn't melted yet in the shadows. Won't get it done before winter, he said. Maybe the one after. And I stood there at the bottom of nothing this time. No ladder between us anymore. Just two old men in a half-built room and the long gold light. And I thought about how a man can spend 2 years being laughed at for knowing the truth, and then save 19 lives with it, and lose 3 fingers doing it, and have the whole thing forgotten by most folks inside of 3 springs, and still go back out into the cold leaning evening, to build a room where he can teach the showing of it to whoever's left who wants to learn. I didn't help him with the post. He didn't ask, and I've learned to let a man have his own work when the work is the thing keeping him here. But I took the log out of my coat, the green one, the rubber band gone gray, and I leaned it on the truck hood, and I wrote the last entry I mean to write about Gus Renner, because some stories you finish and some you just stop adding to once you understand them. I wrote, he's building a school nobody asked for, to teach a thing most folks have already let themselves forget, with hands he gave to the cold so a stranger wouldn't die in the dark. I held the rope once. It's the only useful thing I ever did out here, and I'd do it again, and I'm not sure he knows that, and I'm not sure I'll ever find the way to. I didn't finish it. The light was going. Gus had another post to set, and anyway, some things you write down to remember and some things